Ladies and gentlemen, I have an announcement. There's a storm coming through, so we need to move you all into the forward room. No, I'm kidding. I'm teasing. Welcome back. Thank you all so much for being here again, back at Sacred Trust. And again, on behalf of the National Park Service, we want to express our appreciation to the Gettysburg Foundation and Wayne Motts for bringing this series back. We've had 3 days of excellent lectures by historians, guides, CEOs of nonprofits, and so it's great to have you here. Our next speaker needs no introduction, but I'll give him one anyways. Wayne Motts is the president and CEO of the Gettysburg Foundation. He has been a licensed battlefield guide for 34 years. He is the author and co-author of numerous books and articles on the American Civil War, including Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg, a guide to the most famous attack in American history, which he co-authored with James Hessler. And I think we're in for a fascinating talk this afternoon. So please join me in welcoming Wayne Motts.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. All right. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Now, yesterday, Gary Edelman had 158. If I don't have 159 in here, I'm going to be mad. And we had to run, and you won't get run out on my tour like you did or on my talk. Sorry to Gary for that. What a wonderful, wonderful last 3 days we've had here at the Gettysburg Foundation, Gettysburg National Military Park. Wonderful. And we've got one more talk tonight for those of you that are holding tickets to Dr. Alan Gelzo, who's going to be in our auditorium. But I'm just really blessed to be able to have the final back cleanup here for you all for the Gettysburg Foundation for the Sacred Trust Lecture Series for 2022. And this is an interesting topic that I happened to stumble on, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I happened to stumble on it as we go forward. But first thing I want to do, as I do with all my talks, is I want to dedicate this talk today. And there's no better person to dedicate it to. He couldn't be here with us, but I want to dedicate this to my dad, Warren Motts. Now, this is me strangling my dad at Lee Harvey Oswald's grave. So this is Lee Harvey Oswald's grave, everybody, and I'm strangling my dad over Lee Harvey Oswald's grave in Dallas, Texas. So my dad taught me everything I know about the Civil War. He's the one that really lit the spark and said, do whatever you want to do, but be the best at what you want to do. And when I said I wanted to be in history, my dad didn't say, hey, that's nuts. How are you going to make a living? I think a lot of people would have done that, but my dad didn't. So I was a little kid running around with the cap and the flag. You can see it over in the left-hand corner up at Pickett's Charge. And now I get to be here, and with the help of the National Park Service and the staff of the Gettysburg Foundation, all the great volunteers, to make a difference here at Gettysburg. So it's just an honor of my life to be here. And I just really appreciate it. So my dad is riding in Jeeps in the Columbus, Ohio 4th of July parade right now with Motts Military Museum. So that's why he's not here at this presentation. But so Dad, here's to you for all the great things, discovering stories related to the Civil War. And I'm going to talk about a story related to the Civil War and the Titanic. And the question is, Wayne, how in the heck did you find this? So I went online and I did some Googling, American Civil War, Titanic. There are some connections, and here are some of them. The believed engineer, we think, of the Alabama on the Titanic, Frank D. Millett, and he was born about 1848, so he was a really young man in the Civil War, and he's in the 60th Massachusetts in the Civil War. Archibald Gracie, who was a Confederate general, his son, born right at the time of the Civil War. Gracie was killed in the Civil War, so Archibald Gracie IV dies on the Titanic, son of the Confederate general of the Civil War. And our own Washington Roebling, who was with Gouverneur Warren on Little Round Top. He married Gouverneur Warren's sister. He's an engineering officer here. His uncle, with the Roebling Wire Company, died on the Titanic. So we've got some connections here. But as far as I know, the person I'm going to tell you about is the only person that fought in the Battle of Gettysburg that I know of that happened to be on the steamer, the Titanic, and went down. What an interesting story. So I Googled some things, typed in Titanic, typed in Civil War, and it led me to a single name of a man named Edward G. Crosby. Everybody said, who is it? I didn't give the name out so you all would come. Why do you think I did that? It's like, who is it? Everybody inside is like, who is it? I said, I'm not telling you. So only one member of the staff knew because he said, you know, Wayne, I got to stand in here and sell tickets and work. I said, okay, I'm going to let you know, but you got to be sworn to secrecy here. So the man's name, and this is his pension card from the National Archives, is Edward G. Crosby of Company E of the 1st Michigan Cavalry Regiment. And look what it says down at the bottom of the card. His date of death, April 15, 1912, steamer Titanic, Atlantic Ocean. Says it right on there. So did this man die in the Titanic? He did. The only question is, can we prove he's at Gettysburg? So now we want to set out to try to figure out, is this man at Gettysburg? Now, I've never given this talk in public before. It's the first time I've ever given it, but I did give it to a small group of our donors, and to get ready for it, I went, that was kind of the dry run. That was not recorded. This will be recorded. People will be able to see it. So this is the first time I've given this in public. And when I did that presentation, I went to where this man was from and collected some historical information. And Edward Crosby, he was born in New York. We'll talk a little bit about that. He lived in Michigan, and he moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So when he boarded the Titanic, he's actually a resident of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I contacted the Milwaukee Historical Society in downtown Milwaukee in November of this last year. I went and I visited the Milwaukee Historical Society. And they pulled out the Grand Army of the Republic, the Union Veterans Organization, after the American Civil War. It was founded in 1866. The Milwaukee Historical Society has the original sketch book, and that's the book that the soldiers wrote their service records in for members of the post in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And the Milwaukee Historical Society pulled out the original book. This is the front cover of it, right here. It's the personal wartime sketchbook of the E.B. Walcott Post of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the leather-bound book, it's not in very good shape, was presented to the post by the Women's Relief Corps of Milwaukee in 1890. Now, this is a post that starts in the 1880s, and our subject doesn't join the post until 1901. So inside this book, the people who are members of the post, the Civil War soldiers who are members of this post, write down their career and what it is. So I turn to over page 400 in here. It's actually page 495. And this was Edward Crosby's entry in the GAR post record book. Take a look at it. It's got the steamer Titanic right on it. And his picture. Now, this has never been published, so what you're seeing here in this talk today, there are several things here that have never been put out on the screen. And then I'm going to show you a close-up of it because it's really, so this is his war service record. We've got an LED wall, so the pointer really doesn't work. So there's a war service record. And then down on the bottom of this, he was to sign and verify that the story he put in here is true. And what's interesting about this is he did not write this sketch. Someone else wrote it for him. And it looks like they probably wrote it after he died, even though he was a member of this post in 1901. He became a member, 1901, 11 years before he died on the Titanic. This is a close-up of it, and it says, died April 15, 1912, right down at the bottom, was lost on the steamer Titanic, age 70. This man was 21 years old at Gettysburg, and he was 70 years old in 2 months when he died on the Titanic. It also says, which I found interesting, down in the bottom right-hand corner, I wrote it down, he was a hero on land and on the sea. His body was found floating and buried in the Forest Home Cemetery. So they later take his body to the cemetery, it's cremated, then it's buried elsewhere, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But when I went out there, it's pretty interesting because I said, wow, here's a picture of him as an older man. Here's a picture of the Titanic. So there's no question this soldier was on the Titanic. And what we've got to try to do is run down, does he actually have a Gettysburg service record that says he's present for duty at Gettysburg? And so, spoiler alert, yes, he is, everybody. I'll show you that here, or else we wouldn't be doing this talk, right? But I thought that the Battle of Gettysburg folks were cult-like. I can't believe the people that study the Titanic. Did you know there's a Great Lakes Society of Titanic people just for the Great Lakes? So, and they study only the people that came from the Great Lakes that died on the Titanic. It's the Great Lakes Titanic Historical Society. And then there's a Titanic Historical Society. And then there is an entire online encyclopedia for the Titanic. So most of the things we tell you today on the Titanic are going to come from the Titanic Encyclopedia. So for you body counters out there, if it's slightly different than what you read, I'm just giving you from the Encyclopedia of the Titanic some of the stats related to it. But I contacted the Titanic Historical Society, and one of the members had written 2 small articles on Crosby and actually met Crosby's granddaughter, who, believe it or not, died when she was 90 years old as part of this story. So they got original records from the family, and then lucky for me, they gave copies to Wayne Motts. And one of the things that they gave me from the Titanic Historical Society was a picture of Edward Crosby as a trooper in the 1st Michigan Cavalry. So here's a post-war photograph of him taken at the turn of the century. Here is a photograph of him during the Civil War. And this came right out of the family and given to me from the Titanic Historical Society. So let me tell you a little bit about this man. So he's born February 18, 1842. His service record says he was born in Macedon, Wayne County, New York, but his pension record says Ontario, New York. Now, where is this? This is south of Rochester, and it would be west of Syracuse, New York. Okay, that's actually where this is. So he's got two birthplaces listed in the official records as to where he's from, and some of this comes from his discharge, and some of it comes from his pension papers, which means he gave 2 different locations for his own birth. So he doesn't know where he's born. That's not unusual. Not unusual. He's one of 5 children. His father was a carpenter, and he spent, it looks like, at least 2 years in Genesee College. And that's interesting because that was a Methodist seminary that turned to college. It was founded in 1831. Help me with New Yorkers. Is it Lima or Lima, New York? Lima. There you go. That's where it is. And then it got moved to Syracuse, and guess what? It became Syracuse University. So where he studied for 2 years, I don't know what his track of study was. I don't know what he actually studied. I just know he had a college education. And in the 1850s, he moves to Michigan, to Hudson, Michigan, which is about 90 to 100 miles southwest of Detroit. 90 to 100 miles southwest of Detroit. That's actually where he's from. And like I said, once again, sometime, we don't know exactly when, in the 1850s. I can't find him in the 1860 census. I can't find him in the 1910 census. He does have a pretty common name, but there's further research that's going to be done on this. Then in 1861, on August 15, he will enlist in Hudson, Michigan. He'll enlist in Hudson. He'll be enrolled 100 miles away in Detroit in 1861, and he will join the 1st Michigan Cavalry Regiment, which will become part of Custer's Michigan Cavalry Brigade here in the Battle of Gettysburg. At his enlistment, it says that he's 5'9", and it also says that he was a broom maker by occupation. And I'm putting this down so that you all know this man doesn't come from money. He doesn't have money. He makes all the money that he will later earn to become, in our view, at least for 2022, he would be $1 million worth of wealth that he will have. Doesn't have that much in 1912, but that's what it would calculate to if we had it here today. It'd be in the millions that he had. So he actually makes all his own funding from his own labor and his own initiative. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, Michigan Cavalry, the 1st Michigan Cavalry Regiment had 12 companies. It's one of the most action-scene regiments of the entire American Civil War. For those of us that are battlefield guides, there's a book out there by a man named William Fox called Regimental Losses of the Civil War. And William Fox was a member of the 107th New York Volunteer Infantry Regiment. And sometimes this work is called Fox's Fighting 300s. And he attempted to list 300 of the regiments that lost the most number of men killed or mortally wounded in combat in the Civil War, not men that died of disease. And if you were a veteran, after this book is published in 1898, and your regiment was one of Fox's Fighting 300s, that was a label that you carried around, that you told everybody. The cavalry regiments, in some cases, if they lost more than 10% of their men, they're also listed. So we had two standards. One was a numerical standard over 200. One was a percentage standard. And the four top regiments of cavalry for losses in the Civil War are all in the Army of the Potomac. Number one, most loss of cavalry regiments in the Civil War, 1st Maine Cavalry. And number two is the 1st Michigan Cavalry Regiment of David Gregg's division. And it looks like it loses in combat 164 men killed or mortally wounded in action in the Civil War. And of course, we've got a loss here at Gettysburg. So just so you understand, this man's enrolling in a cavalry unit that's going to see a lot of battle action for the American Civil War. Now, what actions is he in? Well, based on his service record, he is in the following. And, you know, the Sickles Report for Jim Hessler. This man's an orderly for Dan Sickles. I couldn't believe it. My colleague, co-author, and friend of many years sitting up in the front row. So you couldn't have paid anybody to. Can you believe this? So I pulled his service record, National Archives, and it says orderly for General Sickles. I couldn't believe it. Or messenger in some cases. So in the fall of 1862, he's a messenger. He definitely is at the Battle of Hanover. I didn't put in Hunterstown, although he is there. And he is in this action on East Cavalry Field. Now, how do we know that? Because I got to go down to the National Archives and pull his actual service record. Now, you all probably know that the National Archives was closed for like 2 years because of COVID. A year ago, on the 24th of June, I got to get into the National Archives with special permission because I was giving a program here at the park on a different topic for last year's talk in the evening. So I begged the archivist, can I get in down there? And they let me into the archives, and I got to pull the service record and pension record of Edward Crosby, and you're going to see photographs of that. So I want to thank the archive staff for allowing this courtesy to get it, and because I was doing it for the park, I'm sure that was one of the reasons why they were able to let me in, which was really nice. Here is his June 30th muster card that shows May-June, present for duty, Company E, 1st Michigan Cavalry. So for us, how do we know, barring any unforeseen complications, this man's in the Battle of Gettysburg? This is how we check. We check the service record to find out that's here. He's not wounded here. He doesn't get sick here. He is hurt later on. But he is in this action on July 3rd, 1863, what we call East Cavalry Field. If you remember your history, this is not going to be the battle history of the Battle of Gettysburg and East Cavalry Field and Pickett's Charge. But remember, on July 3rd, there's an attack in the center of the Union line, and Stuart goes to the rear, and my colleague and co-author and I, we believe there's no coordination in those actions. Stuart is out east of Gettysburg, but he's not to attack the Union line at the same time or attack the Union line at the same time Pickett's men are attacking the center over there. He's having a distraction over there. He's disrupting that part of the battlefield, but he's not making an outright attack. Nonetheless, there's a cavalry action out there that's one of the most noted in the Civil War. And this is the map from American Battlefield Trust related to it. And you'll see the 1st Michigan Cavalry down at the base of the map near the Spangler Farm, near the intersection of the Low Dutch Road and the Hanover Pike here. These are roads that are critical to the movement of the Union troops east of Gettysburg. And you probably all know what happens there. I asked my colleague just a minute ago, what numbers are we using? So maybe about 5,000 Confederates, maybe about 2,800 of the Union troops, but my colleague was quick to remind me about 1,900 for the Michigan Cavalry Brigade alone there. And Custer himself will lead 2 charges out there at least. Here is the artillery battery that is there, Pennington's battery. So this is near where the 1st Michigan Cavalry and very near where Edward Crosby will be in position on July 3rd, 1863. There's a battery here in the foreground, and there's also one in the background, which is batteries E and H of the 1st. Battery E of the 1st U.S. Light Artillery is next to this one. And one of the officers in that battery, by the way, guess what? He was at Fort Sumter. That's going to be the next talk by Wayne Motts. And he's at this battery on East Cavalry Field. And the 1st Michigan Cavalry is right near here. You'll have to get a tour from my colleague. Jim or one of the other guys, but preferably Jim, let him go out there on the battlefield, because this is what he studies. So he's helped me along on this. Here's the Michigan Cavalry Brigade shaft. So this is where the charge is, and this is seen from the Confederate line looking over toward the Rummel Farm, which is right smack dab in the middle of this cavalry action. So if you remember, Custer will be in a charge with the 7th Michigan Cavalry. He'll be in a charge with the 1st Michigan Cavalry, and 2 of these cavalry units, the 5th and 6th Michigan Cavalry, the 5th is armed with Spencer repeating rifles, wholly armed, and the 6th is partly armed, and one of those rifles from the 5th Michigan Cavalry, carried here at East Cavalry Field, is in the new exhibit, A Rough Course Life. So if you haven't seen that, that's an actual Spencer repeating rifle used by Custer's troops here at Gettysburg, and it is in our new exhibit. So if you're Edward Crosby, you survived this mounted attack, and this would have been with Colonel Towne and the 1st Michigan Cavalry on July 3rd, 1863. We know what happened here. It's a strategic defeat for the Confederates. They're not going to be able to disrupt the Union line any further than what you see here. And then Crosby will serve with his regiment. Here you'll see he's with the messenger to Sickles. He's in these many engagements. He's present with this regiment until April of 1864. July of 1864, while moving to protect some wagons, at least according to his pension, he's thrown from his horse where he injures his spine and left testicle. That's what it says in the pension record. And for that, he will get a pension. He's discharged out of the service in 1864. He has 3 years service. And then, interestingly enough, right before Appomattox, or actually right after Appomattox, just a couple days after Appomattox, he will join a unit called the Veteran Volunteers. And General Hancock tried to raise 20,000 volunteer troops, and they're going to put them in 9 regiments, and to join them, you had to have at least 2 years of honorably discharged service to even get in there. So he's going to be involved in that unit for a year between April of 1865 and April of 1866. Then when the Civil War is over, he's going to go back to Hudson, Michigan, about 100 miles west of Detroit, southwest, and he will marry this woman. This is Catherine Elizabeth Halstead, and they call her Kitty. And according to his marriage certificate, he married her April 18, 1868. So he's been out of the service about 2 years, and his occupation is millwright. So his father's a carpenter. He enters the service as a broom maker. And then in 1868, he is listed as millwright. In the 1870 census, he is listed as working in a sawmill. So it's going to take him a while to gain this wealth that we talk about when he gets his first-class ticket on the Titanic. The Crosbys have 3 children. So his oldest daughter is born in 1870, and she dies in 1880 of what they call bilious fever. So she's only 10 years old, his oldest daughter. His middle daughter, Harriet, we're going to talk a lot more about her. Harriet was born October 8, 1872. And she will be on the Titanic with her mother and father, 39 years old. But she's born in 1872. She does not die until 1941 in Los Angeles, California. And then the youngest son is born in 1881, and he dies in 1966. So they have 3 children. 2 of them live to adulthood, and 2 of them have issue of children. This line goes on, ladies and gentlemen, today. In 1880, he's listed as a laborer in Muskegon, Michigan, which is on Lake Michigan coast, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And in 1881, he is a tug captain. So basically, after working in a sawmill, working as a millwright, he saves up enough money by 1881 to become a tug captain, and eventually he's going to buy a ship and get involved in the transportation business around Lake Michigan. He becomes a ship's captain, and he dies on the Titanic. So think about that. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that means when he's on. Here's the St. Lawrence Seaway. This is over 2,000 miles of waterway. You can go up to the right of the slide, get on the St. Lawrence River, and go all the way through the Great Lakes using a lock system. Now you'll notice over at Lake Michigan, in the far left in the map, you've got Muskegon, Michigan. You've also got Grand Haven, I don't know what else is all listed on the maps. These are all west of Grand Rapids. I've got some friends in here from Michigan. And you can get a ferry to go across the lake. So what if you want to get to Milwaukee, Wisconsin? You got to get on a train to go down to Chicago and go around Lake Michigan, or you can take a ferry across the lake. And that is exactly the business that Edward Crosby, once he gets his tugs, he actually becomes a government contractor. He builds piers in Michigan, and then he starts a ferry business around 1894 to ferry passengers across Lake Michigan. And what does that look like? Here is a Google Earth map of Lake Michigan. So, if you want to go from Muskegon, Michigan, up on the top right-hand corner of the map, over to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and you do that by boat, how far do you have to go? 85 miles. But if you want to go all the way around to Chicago and then up to Milwaukee, it's going to take you 279 miles to do that. If you do that today by ferry, you can do it in 2.5 hours. And they do it today by ferry, even with your car, for 2.5 hours. To drive this, it's going to take you at least 5.5 hours to be able to drive this. And that depends on what the traffic is, ladies and gentlemen, inside Chicago, right? You got to get around Chicago to get up to Milwaukee. In 1894, Edward Crosby buys a ship. He has half interest in it, and it is a passenger steamer in 1894 called the Nyack. And here it is. This is a postcard that I bought online of the SS Nyack. The Nyack was built in 1878. It's 253 feet long. It was a wooden passenger vessel built in Buffalo, New York. It had 4 decks, and it was in service, get this, from about 1878 all the way to 1932, when it's basically cut down and its hull is used to be a pier, to actually be to be a pier on land. So they get a lot of use out of these ships, just like they do in a lot of years. Now, if you want to go on that ferry today, I looked it up just today. They'll do it 3 times from Milwaukee over to Muskegon, Michigan, 3 times. A motorcycle is $61. $61 to go on freight to do that today. It's $115 for a car and $105 for a person. So it costs, if you want to do this today, take your car and yourself, just standard fare, $220. And given the gas prices, you're going to get there at half the time, maybe cheaper than what you got to go through today. But I'm going to show you what it also was back in 1914 because it's really interesting. So Crosby is getting this cross Lake Michigan transportation business, and he is also going up and down the coast. He's going down to Chicago. He's going up to Sheboygan, Wisconsin. He's going up to Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. They're going to all these different places, and it's real interesting to watch it. So this is an advertisement that I found in the Milwaukee Historical Society for an excursion up to Sheboygan, Wisconsin, which is north of Milwaukee, and you could do that round trip for 50 cents. And of course you buy food, they sell you a bunch of stuff, this is how they make money. And Crosby moved from Michigan over to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and they set up their headquarters in this building, which is built in 1860. The Crosby Transportation Company, founded by Edward Crosby of our 1st Michigan Cavalry and of Titanic fame. The office was in this building, which is still there. It's called the Iron Block Building. And how do we know this? Because we can look at the Milwaukee City directories. We know where these people are working, and we also know where they live. Now, when I went to the Milwaukee Historical Society, they had documents from the Crosby Transportation Company, and here is a map from the Crosby Transportation Company showing Lake Michigan's in the far corner. On the far left of the map, the dotted line is Milwaukee, going over Lake Michigan. So what did Edward Crosby do? He befriended the head of the Grand Trunk Railroad that goes from New England and also all across Canada. And this railroad was founded in 1852. And this man's name was Charles Melville Hayes. Charles Melville Hayes was the president of the Grand Trunk Railroad. Guess where he died? On the Titanic. Right. He may have been, he was over there getting financing, and the two of the men probably got together, that most certainly on the Titanic ship. All those dotted lines, ladies and gentlemen, are railroad and ferry connections. So you could get on a ferry and go from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and you could be in New York. If you left on a Sunday, on Tuesday you'd be in New York. You could be there in 48 hours, you'd be in New York City. Think about that. I mean, if you drove even full-time in a car, I don't know how long it would take. That's pretty good, making the ferry connections and also going by train. So this becomes a, really a very lucrative business. Now, here is the 1914 schedule, 2 years after the Titanic, for Crosby and his line. And if you look down here at the bottom, Fred Crosby, which is Edward Crosby's son, is the general manager after his father actually dies on the Titanic. This was the closest one I could find to the sinking at the Titanic. And I just told you, an automobile costs what? $115 in 2022, one way. On here, it is $7 one way, up at the top, to go one way from Michigan across to Milwaukee. $7. How much was a motorcycle? Anybody remember? $61, right? What is it in 1914? $1. That's what it is. So this business becomes pretty lucrative. Here is the scheduled season. So during the season now, you can go on a Sunday, you can leave Milwaukee Sunday night, Monday morning you're over in Michigan. Then you're getting on the railroad train and you're going over to New York. And you can go to New York City, you can go to Ontario, Canada, you can go any of these places. Clear up into New England if you want, on the West Coast. And Edward Crosby not only had this transportation business, he had contracts for ticket sales to sell tickets of his ferry customers on the railroad. So he and Charles Melville Hayes, the president of the Grand Trunk Railroad, they're together on these business ventures and business deals. Now, his daughter Harriet, who was 39 years old in 1912, had a pretty challenged life. So she married a man who was a traveling salesman in Flint, Michigan. And that marriage ended up in divorce. Then she goes across and decides she wants to take music lessons in Europe. Now remember, Dad now owns all the interest in these boats, and now he's got money. So he sends his daughter, along with her friend, in 1910 over to France and England to study music. She meets and falls in love with a man who is married. She becomes pregnant with his child, and she delivers that child on the 11th of February, 1912. 2 months before the Titanic sails. Meanwhile, Edward Crosby and his wife Catherine go over to France and England to bring their daughter back to the United States. And they've got a new granddaughter, but the new granddaughter, for reasons we don't fully understand, is left in England at a boarding school at age 2 months. And I'm not sure why they don't want to bring this child back. So the daughter, Harriet, who's, think about that, having a child in 1912 at 39. She's 39. They leave this daughter, and her name is Andrea. A-N-D-R-E-E is her name. Andrea. And they're going to sail, the daughter, Harriet, the mother, Catherine, the father, Edward, our Edward from Gettysburg, on the Titanic. They're going to get on at Southampton, England on April 10. They're going to go down to Cherbourg, France, then to Queenstown, Ireland, which is what the Titanic does, and then it's going to start its maiden voyage across the Atlantic. This ship, there's a lot of history, and I need not go into it, but it's part of the White Star Line. This is a shipping line that J. Bruce Ismay is the owner and general chairman of. He sat down with the builders in the Irish building yards that built the ships for the White Star Line and says, they're kind of like Wayne Motts, that's what I say here. How can we beat all competition? That's what Wayne says when he's here. And these two men are there saying, look, the Cunard Line just launched two ships that are luxury vessels going across the Atlantic Ocean. One of those ships you all know here is the Lusitania. And the Lusitania was sunk in 1915 by a German U-boat that helped hasten the war, of course, entrance of the war for the United States. J. Bruce Ismay and the builder of the ships of White Star Lines from Ireland are meeting together and say, we're going to build ships that are going to beat them. And they decide to build 3 ships, and you've heard of all of them. The Britannic, the Titanic, and the Olympia. You've heard of all 3 of those ships. Olympic, all 3 of those. Those are the 3 ships. The Olympic is the sister ship to the Titanic. The Titanic, this is its maiden voyage. It's 828 feet long. It's over 90 feet wide. It can have a crew and passengers of well over 3,000. On this voyage, it had a crew and passengers of about 2,200, and the loss on it is going to be about 1,500. Now, let's remember that the Crosbys are pretty wealthy people, so they can afford a first-class ticket on the Titanic. And so, Catherine is there, Harriet is there, and this daughter, Andrea, is left in England at age 2 months. This is a photograph of Andrea and her mother in 1920 from a passport, because they would go back and forth. Harriet never marries the father of this girl, never marries him. But she actually Andrea becomes a professional dancer, and she dies much later in life. And the mother's height, so Harriet is 5 feet 8 inches tall, and Andrea is 6 feet 4 inches tall. Look at her size just as a little girl. So she grows to the height of 6 feet 4, and she actually becomes a professional dancer, which is another part of this. So I'm Edward Crosby. I have my wife and my 39-year-old daughter, and I'm buying a first-class ticket on the Titanic. Wow. I tried to calculate what that is. They have how much it is in pounds. It looks like just for a standard ticket as a first-class passenger, in today's money, it would be over $4,000 or $5,000. So it's not as expensive as what I thought it was going to be, but if you have a suite, a parlor suite, that's all additional funding that's here. So the Titanic had 9 decks. There were at least 101 suite rooms and 2 sitting rooms, and the Crosbys had 2 rooms on the port side of the Titanic. The daughter had 1 room separate, and Edward and his wife Catherine had a separate room. And there are deck plans on the Encyclopedia Titanic. Everything you want to know is on there. And the 2 upper blocks, on the outside block on the port side of the ship, this is the front of the ship to the right of the side. So they're right up near the front of the ship. So on the far right, Suite 26 is where Harriet Crosby is. That's the inner red block. Suite 22, where Edward Crosby and his wife are located, are on the very far outside of the ship. And this is what the plans look like. They're on B deck, so they're right below the top deck, which means when the Titanic does hit that iceberg, the Crosbys are in pretty good position to be able to get out. Remember, if you're a third-class passenger, you're clear down in the bottom of the ship. So you've got first class, second class, and third class passengers. And many of the 1,500 people that perished on the Titanic, many of them were members of the third class because they couldn't get out from below. They weren't warned quick enough. The captain didn't let the warning go out quick enough, at least reading the testimony. So here's where it looks like on the side. So here's the front of the ship. This ship has got everything: electric elevators, a pool. The first class accommodations on this ship were beyond any first class ship that the Cunard Line had, or any line that did transatlantic transportation at the time that the Titanic sunk in 1912. The second class accommodations on the Titanic were equal to first class accommodations anywhere else. So this is above and beyond what you'll see anywhere. Wooden paneling, I mean real woods, real stuff is being used. And if you had a first class ticket in one of these, you actually had your own servant for a room that was there to be there with you. So the Titanic strikes an iceberg. We all know the history of it. April 14, 1912. Strikes the iceberg at about 11:40 a.m. Mrs. Crosby and Harriet Crosby survived this. And Mrs. Crosby, in May of 1912, during the Titanic hearings, actually submits an affidavit that gives what happened to them on the Titanic. And here's what she says. First of all, she wants you to know that she's out earlier watching the crew members take temperature readings. And because her husband is a sailor, she knows what they're doing because Edward Crosby tells her that this is what they're doing. At the time, my husband and I were walking up and down the promenade deck. This is a direct quote from Catherine Crosby, the wife of our soldier, which, as I recollect it, was the deck below the hurricane deck. And it was while we were walking up and down this deck that I first noticed that seamen taking temperature of the water. My husband was a sailor all his lifetime, and he told me all about it. And it was from that I knew what they were doing. I could see what they were doing. My husband retired about 9 p.m. This is April 14, 1912. And I retired about 10:30 p.m. Elmer Taylor, one of the passengers who went over the steamer with us, told me afterwards when we were on the Carpathia that on the time I retired that night, he noticed the boat was going full speed. Remember, one of the things that's blamed here is that Captain Smith, the captain of the Titanic, wants to break all speed records. He wants to smash everything. He's Wayne Motts wearing a captain's hat on the Titanic that's there. So I guess there's a moral for there, isn't there? That's here. So he wants this boat traveling very fast. And some accounts have it traveling at around 22 knots. The speed record was around 24 knots. So, and they know that there's icebergs in the area because there's wireless transmission from ships telling them, hey, there's icebergs in this area. So I'm going to continue with Mrs. Crosby. Quote, I had not retired long when I was suddenly awakened by a thumping on the boat. The engine stopped suddenly. This was about 11:30 p.m. Captain Crosby got up, dressed, went out, and came back and said to me, quote, you will lie there and drown, end quote. And when he went out again, he said to my daughter, this boat is badly damaged, but I think the watertight compartments will hold her up. So the Titanic had at least 5 of its watertight compartments that were compromised. It could survive if only a couple of those were, the integrity was lost, but it can't survive if there's basically 5 of them that have been hit by this iceberg, which is what happened. So this ship is going down, folks, and it hits at 11:40 p.m. and at 2:20 a.m. it's completely under the water for the size of this ship. So think about that. She then says, quote, I got up and then dressed, and then my daughter dressed, followed by my husband on deck, and she got up on deck, and the officer told her to go back and get her life preserver and come back to the deck as soon as possible. She reported that to me, and we both went out on the deck when the officer told us to come. I think we were the first or second boat that we got into, end quote. Now, you get on the Encyclopedia Titanica, there is an entire listing of everybody in every lifeboat. So it looks like the Crosbys are on lifeboat number 7, and Mrs. Crosby said that there were at least 36 people in her lifeboat, but much of the testimony says there's only about 26 people in their lifeboat, and the lifeboat could hold 65 people. So not only does the Titanic not have enough lifeboats, they're not filling the lifeboats before they are sending them down. And the Crosbys are on either the first or second lifeboat to be launched off of the Titanic, and Mr. Crosby, for reasons unknown, stays on the Titanic and unfortunately goes down with the Titanic. Now, once Mrs. Crosby and the daughter get onto Carpathia, which is the next morning on the 15th, they're on the Carpathia. The passengers are able to send wireless traffic to let the family know that, hey, look, you know, we're okay. They actually land in New York as well, so let's remember that. They get over to New York. Fred Crosby gets a wireless transmission that it says his family's okay. There's no details, and it's actually printed in the paper. This is what it says. This is printed in, this was reprinted in the Appleton Post, which it comes out of a Milwaukee paper. April 18, safe on the Carpathia, signed Harriet Crosby. But what Fred Crosby doesn't know sitting in Milwaukee is that his dad is dead because there's no detail other than this. This is all it says. So he thinks everybody is safe on there just by looking at this. Unfortunately, Mr. Crosby goes down on the Titanic. They later get word that he has died on the Titanic, and there is a moment of silence for him on the Titanic. Now, Fred Crosby's father, Edward Crosby, our soldier from the 1st Michigan Cavalry, actually has his body recovered. There are bodies recovered off the coast of Newfoundland from the Titanic. And the White Star Line hires a ship to recover bodies. The crew is paid double, and the charge was $500 a day to recover bodies to the White Star Line from this steamship. Now, how much is that today? It's $16,000 a day is what it costs. That's what White Star paid to have this ship. They actually contracted 2 ships to do it. This is the name of the ship, one of the 2, the one most known that recovered bodies from the Titanic, the Mackay Bennett. And this was a cable-laying ship built to lay cable in the Atlantic, built in 1884. This ship actually retrieved over 300 bodies. And they noted in order the bodies that were retrieved. Now, you probably know John Jacob Astor was on the Titanic. His worth was estimated in 1912 dollars at $87 million. That's over $2 billion today. And a $100,000 reward was put out for the recovery of his body. And the crew of the Mackay Bennett got to split it. That's $100,000 in 1912. That's about $2.8 million today. And they found John Jacob Astor's body, and they retrieved it. And John Jacob Astor's body was in the 100s. I didn't write down what the number was, but I can tell you that Edward Crosby's body was body number 269. Body number 269. And he was identified clothing, green tweed suit and overcoat. Estimated age, 65. Hair, gray. On his person, $500, 80 pounds in notes, 6 pounds in gold in his purse, 8 shillings and $6 in silver. A pipe in a memo book. E.G. Crosby. So they knew who he was because he's got these personal belongings, including the memo book, that says who he is. Now remember, the bodies are in the North Atlantic off of Newfoundland, which means they're frozen. They are preserved. This is grisly work done by the Mackay Bennett. And the Mackay Bennett brings these bodies in about April 30th, 1912, and puts them on shore at Halifax, Nova Scotia, and then takes the bodies to an ice rink where they can be preserved. If you were a first-class passenger on the Titanic, your body got a coffin, as well as was embalmed. If you were second-class passenger on the Titanic, your body was embalmed and was wrapped in canvas. And if you were a third-class passenger on the Titanic, your body was buried at sea. And many of those lost in the third class, of course, because a lot of these folks aren't accounted for. We don't know the names of everyone that died on the Titanic. That's not known. Here is a photograph of the bodies coming in to Halifax, Nova Scotia. This is probably taken on the 30th of April, 1912. Now, meanwhile, Fred Crosby finds out that his father has died on the Titanic. The body's been recovered, and he has just recovered from an illness. So he can't go to retrieve the father's body. The mother and daughter are down in New York and then on their way home, ladies and gentlemen, to go to Milwaukee. So Fred Crosby, the son of Edward Crosby, sends Frank Walsh, the manager ticket agent of Crosby Transportation Company, to Halifax, Nova Scotia to claim the body. So in our case, our Civil War soldier that fought at Gettysburg, his body is actually recovered and it is buried. And what's really great, I pulled the pension National Archives. Guess what's in it? The death certificate from Nova Scotia. Here it is. This is the original in his pension record at the National Archives. It says that he is body number 269, that he's approximately 65 years old, and he died April 15, 1912. His residence in Milwaukee, and you can see down at the bottom, cause of death, SS Titanic, right at the very bottom of it. So this is actually inside his pension record, and I made a photograph of it. The body is brought back. Captain Crosby is laid to rest. His body is cremated, and then he is actually entombed in a very ornate, very brand new mausoleum right here called the Fairview Mausoleum. Now, this mausoleum was just opened in 1912. This thing just opened when his body's placed in here. His body is placed in here. His wife's body is in here. And by 1941, his daughter's body is also in here. So 3 of the Crosbys go in here. And unfortunately for this, in 1996, this is in such bad disrepair, the city has to tear it down. So they contract with a cemetery, Graceland Cemetery, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to remove 1,000 remains out of this mausoleum and bury them in the ground in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And if you look up at the top, look at the ornate stonework at the top of the mausoleum. Because when this was tore down in 1996, some of that stonework was brought to the cemetery. I'll show it to you in a minute. What is where this is today? Where is the location of the Fairview Mausoleum in Milwaukee, Wisconsin? Wayne went there to take its picture. It is now station number 35 of the Milwaukee Fire Department. This is where the mausoleum stood, and the city took it over as a fire company. And there are the stone pillars from the mausoleum now in Graceland Cemetery. Graceland Cemetery won the contract to relocate in 1996 and 1997 1,000 remains from the Fairview Mausoleum, including Edward Crosby, including his daughter who was on the Titanic, and including his wife. And right here is a monument, 2 of them. Well, this is the back of it. There are other monuments there. And then I went out with the help of the caretaker and found the stone. The Titanic Society put a new stone at their grave. All 3 of them are in this grave. 2 of them are cremated remains. 1 of them are casket remains inside the grave. And then there is a memorial stone to the entire Crosby family put there by the Titanic Historical Society. From the battlefield of Gettysburg at age 21 to death in the Atlantic Ocean on the Titanic at age 70. Edward Crosby of the 1st Michigan Cavalry. And I want to thank, if I can, the folks at the Titanic Society, Don Lynch and Mark Rick. They helped supply images. Steve Schaefer from the Milwaukee County Historical Society, Marianne Whitley from the Great Lakes Titanic Society, and Bill Hoffman, who, despite marking the grave, I couldn't even find it at Graceland Cemetery because it's all flat stones. My mother is in a memorial cemetery where all the stones are flat. I'm not going there because I can't find anything in those kind of cemeteries. You know what I mean? I mean, have a stone we can all find and read, everybody. And if you're cremated, get a stone anyway so guys like me can find you. Put in memoriam or something on there if you don't like it, but just get a stone so people can find you out there. So, I love these stories. This connects Gettysburg with the bigger picture out there. It gets people interested. The Titanic is the 3rd highest grossing movie in the history of the United States. Jim, what, your Captain America, I think, beat it. Beat Titanic. It's on there. But how do we get people interested in the Civil War? We tell them new stories. We tell them new stories, and this is one of them. So thank you so much. I appreciate everything. I'll try to take a few questions before we wrap it up. The building's going to close in 10 minutes. Thank you all. Appreciate it. All right.